In this video, we'll cover the important topic of web accessibility. I'll be providing you with a complete checklist of everything you need to know about the WCAG 2.2 guidelines, broken up into the 3 compliance levels. Hey guys, and welcome to Dual Coding. If you've got a website or app, it's important to consider how accessible it is, so that more people are able to use it. Some websites don't even have the basics covered, but after this video, you'll hopefully know what to do to fix any issues really easily. The WCAG 2.2 guidelines for accessibility are split into 3 levels. A, which is the minimum level that everyone should achieve, AA, which is the target that most websites should aim for, and AAA, which is the strictest level for those wanting to go a bit further. Bear in mind that AA includes everything in A and so on. I put together a free checklist split into the 3 levels, and you can download this by following a link to my website in the description. You'll also find some code snippets over there, which we'll cover in the video. So let's get started and check out what you need to do to fulfill the minimum requirement. The most common thing related to accessibility is probably alternative text or alt text. People who have visual impairments might not be able to see an image clearly, and so might rely on a screen reader to describe the image to them. They can do this by reading the alt attribute. I've got an image here of the Eiffel Tower, so I'll add in some alt text to describe the image, keeping it concise but descriptive at the same time. If the image was quite complex and we wanted to give more information, we can add that extra info next to the image, and use aria described by to link up the image to the longer description. I've got another image inside a button, and this is just an icon used for decorative purposes. Because it isn't important and the user can determine what the button does from the text, we can go ahead and leave the alt attribute blank. It's important to include the attribute even though it's empty, so that screen readers can tell that it's a decorative image. We also need to make sure that form fields have labels that accurately describe the data they collect. For this input field, I'm using a label element with the for attribute to link up the label to the input field. And if you're using multiple fields, you should group those into a field set like so, making sure to include a legend element that describes the group. Iframe should also have descriptive text, for example, using a title attribute like so. Let's take a look at error messages for input fields now. If we're using built-in HTML features like required for your input controls, then this should already be picked up by screen readers. If however you've got some custom validation rules, you can use aria invalid set to true. I've got some JavaScript code here that checks the email address, and if it's invalid, it will set aria invalid to true, and also append some text to describe the error. As we saw earlier, we need to use aria described by to link up the error text to the input field. And when the email is invalid, that works as intended. Another thing to consider is semantic elements, such as using H1 to H6 for headings, UL, OL and LI for lists, table, TR, TH and TD elements for tabular data, option elements and opt groups to group options in a select drop-down menu, and so on. As well as semantic elements, there are also aria attributes, like the ones we saw earlier, that improve the accessibility of your site if used correctly. There are many different attributes, so I won't go into all of them, but we'll come across a few over the course of this video. They can be useful when providing additional context. In this scenario, the link says search, but without some additional context, we don't know what we're searching for. We can add in an aria label starting with the link text and extending it with a bit more info. Another aria example is custom radio buttons. As you can see here, we're using aria labeled by instead of the label element. We can also use role attributes to describe a custom element. Here we're using a radio group to group together custom radio buttons, which will work using JavaScript. I'll leave a link in the description for more info on aria attributes. But let's take a look at the use of color next. We need to make sure that we're not just using color as a way of identifying a specific use case. For example, this input field is highlighted in red because there's an error, but there's no text to say that it's invalid. So without an appropriate error message, this wouldn't be accessible. We also need to be careful how we style inline links. As you can see here, this link is a slightly different color to the main text, but there's nothing else to say it's a link. So ideally, we'd want to increase the contrast between the link and the main text like so. Or if we were to hover over the link, it could become underlined, so that would also be acceptable. Another thing related to the use of color is accessible charts. This chart here is not accessible, and not just because there's no alt text, but the colors of the bars are fairly similar, so it might be difficult for someone who is colorblind to distinguish between the data. A good way to overcome this is to use fill patterns like this. I've left a link in the description to an article covering accessible charts in more detail. Now some people may use a keyboard to navigate your site, using the tab key to switch focus between controls. I'm now tabbing through these buttons, but you probably can't notice that too well, as there's no focus state on each of these buttons. We can do this by adding an outline to the control using focus visible. So it's worth noting that any mouse events have a corresponding keyboard event, and this allows users to use your site just with the keyboard. There are some exceptions in Level A, but if you're able to add keyboard functionality, then I definitely recommend doing so. Something else to check is that when a user is tabbing through your site, they don't become trapped. This can happen if they're in a dialog box and there's no close button, for example. Something else that you might have noticed on some sites is a skip to content button, which allows the user to skip to the main section when they're tabbing through your site. This avoids them having to tab through loads of navigation links. I've added in the skip to content button here, along with a couple of navigation links just to demonstrate how it works. In the CSS, we'll need to hide the button initially with a transform, and then when the user focuses on a button, we can show it. Let's test it out. And there we are, those links have now been skipped, and the user is now focused on the main section. Just to demonstrate, I've added in a tab index attribute to the main section so that it's focusable. The tab index attribute should either be set to 0 to make an element focusable, if it isn't already, or -1 to prevent it being focusable. It's important to have a logical focus order, so that the order of elements in your HTML code should be the same as how it appears to the user. One other quick point to make is to ensure that you've set the language of the page using this lang attribute on the HTML tag, and make sure you've added in a title as well. There are a few other things to mention. Be sure to include transcripts and captions for pre-recorded content, and for any visual information in the video that isn't described in the audio, add in a transcript, audio description track, or just a piece of text to describe what's going on in that part of the video. When given instructions, be mindful about describing visual elements. For example, don't say click the round button or click the green button, as the user might not navigate the site visually. Similarly, try to avoid phrases like see the section on the right, and definitely don't rely on sounds. If audio content plays automatically for more than 3 seconds, make sure the user can pause or stop the audio, or at least control the volume within your website or app. If you have shortcuts set up that only uses one letter or symbol, for example pressing the S key will focus on the search bar, make sure the user is able to turn off the shortcut, or remap it to a shortcut with a modifier key like Ctrl S. If the shortcut is only active on a component that has focus, then this requirement doesn't apply. If you've implemented a time limit for certain functionality, you'll need to make sure one of these is true. The user can turn off or adjust the time limit. The user is warned before the time ends and is allowed to extend the time limit. Or the time limit is essential or longer than 20 hours. Then that's also fine. The user should be able to pause, stop or hide moving, blinking or scrolling information if it occurs automatically, lasts more than 5 seconds, or is presented with other content. Users can get distracted by this, so it's always a good idea to control any visual information or effects like this. Another thing to watch out for is to make sure no content flashes for more than 3 times per second, unless it's below the WCAG's flash thresholds. You can find a link to this on page 8 of the PDF checklist. Users should be able to tell what a link does by its text, a label or title, or the surrounding context. Multi-point gestures like pinching with 2 fingers to zoom, or path-based gestures like drawing a shape on a canvas, should also be achieved with a single point gesture, like clicking a button, unless essential. If users click down on a button but then change their mind and move away from the button, the action attached to that button shouldn't trigger. So when users click a button, trigger the action on the mouse up event instead of the mouse down event. If you're using a click event in JavaScript, this is already taken care of. If you've got functionality that detects device motion, for example shaking of the device, there should be an option in place to disable this. And whatever functionality you've got that is triggered by motion should be accessed by normal means, like with the click of a button. Don't change the context when the user inputs information into a text field, interacts with a similar form control, or when an element receives focus. Changes of context could be a substantial change to the page, opening a pop-up window, changing the keyboard focus, or making some other distracting or confusing change. Make sure the help information, such as contact details, FAQs, live chat or contact forms, can be found in the same place across multiple pages, perhaps in the navbar. And lastly, information that the user gave previously that has to be entered again is either auto-populated or available to select, unless it's essential for them to enter it again, for security reasons perhaps. Be sure to download the checklist, linked in the description, to learn more about Level A compliance. Now we've covered the basics, let's look at the next level, which covers what you should aim to achieve. One of the most standard requirements for level AA is to achieve a contrast of 4.5 to 1, or for large text 3 to 1. So let's take a look at what that means. I'm using WebAIM's contrast checker here, linked in the description, and I'm able to adjust the colour here to see if it's compliant with AA standards. And further down is an explanation that says the large text is 18 point or above, or if it's bold then it's 14 point or above. And this large text only needs to be 3 to 1. Let's take a look at some examples here. If this is classed as normal text, what do you think will meet the requirement? It's actually these ones here. The ones that are crossed out wouldn't fulfill the requirement. We also need to be mindful of non-text contrast. For example, these stars here would fail the requirement because the only way we can tell the star rating is by colour. Yellow means the star is filled in and white means it's not. And the contrast between the yellow and the white isn't 3:1. If we were to change that so the stars were filled in with black, or the border thickness changed in addition to the yellow, then this would be fine. It's also important to test out any custom-made focus rings on components when the user is tabbing through. The focus ring colour here doesn't contrast well with the background, so we need to increase the contrast to make it more prominent. Let's take a look at the autocomplete attribute next. All input fields that collect certain user information should include an autocomplete attribute. A list of all fields that are affected is referenced on page 15 of the PDF checklist. But let's see some examples. For names, we've got a few options. We've also got things like street address, country, etc. So it's worthwhile including this attribute, not just for the data to be auto-populated by the browser, but so that the screen reader can better understand the data you're asking for. If you have a minimum width or height set on your website, make sure that this is a minimum width of 320 pixels and minimum height of 256 pixels, so that people don't need to scroll in multiple directions to read the content. Note that images, tables, videos, etc. are exempt from this. If you've got long sets of characters like URLs and German words, you can use overflow wrap to ensure the word doesn't extend off the page. You can also set hyphens to auto, to automatically add in hyphens when breaking up the word. You will also need to ensure that content is still readable if the user were to change their text spacing values. This includes the line height to at least 1.5, spacing following paragraphs to 2 times the font size, letter spacing to at least 0.12 times the font size, and word spacing to at least 0.16 times the font size. Bear in mind that your site doesn't need to look like this. All you need to do is test it out and check that everything's still readable and usable. As we discussed previously, it's important to have a focus indicator set on controls that receive focus. For level AA, we need to make sure that this is adequately visible, either by using a default focus indicator or making your own, ensuring that it meets the contrast level I talked about earlier. The most common way to create a focus ring is by using an outline like so. We can set the focus state of this button in DevTools to see how it looks. But if we don't know what colour the background will be to achieve a good contrast, we can take it one step further and create a 2-colour indicator. We can do this by additionally setting a box shadow, increasing the spread value like so. It's also necessary to make sure that this focus ring doesn't get obscured by other content, so it's worth tabbing through your site to test it out. Unless essential, any dragging movements on your site should be achieved by using a keyboard as well. For example, a draggable map should have button controls to move about and zoom. Another example is this JavaScript plugin for creating accessible reorderable lists, linked in the description. I'm using the mouse here, but I can also use a keyboard just as well. Another thing to consider is the target size of buttons, making sure that they're at least 24 by 24 pixels. Here are some examples that demonstrate this requirement. And there are some concessions for level AA. For example, this button is only 20 by 20, but if we were to draw a 24 by 24 circle at the centre, it wouldn't intersect with other elements, so this would be fine. Also, if the action that this button performs can be achieved by, let's say, a different button that was larger, then this would also be fine. This requirement doesn't apply to links in sentences, or if the target size is essential. In level A, I talked about setting the language of the web page, but in level AA, you need to set the language for any text that's in a different language to the page language. For example, I've got this French sentence here, but the page is mostly in English otherwise. I can set the language on the element with French text to fulfill a requirement. One other thing is status messages. Using the ARIA role attribute, we can identify elements that serve as a status message, like this message that says 5 results returned. Or if there's an error or warning, we can use role alert. And lastly, if you have a log, maybe a console log or activity log, you can similarly use role log. This is all to help screen readers identify status messages and potentially read them out to the user. There are some more things to mention, and these will all be included in the PDF checklist. You now need to provide captions for live content and audio description for pre-recorded content. The user should be able to view and interact with a web page after zooming in 200%, and they should be able to do this in portrait and landscape orientations. Try to create stylized text using CSS instead of images to improve the readability of the page, and double check that page headings and labels are descriptive and informative. Make sure it's possible to access pages on your site using multiple ways, except for pages that are part of a step-by-step process. You could use a sitemap, search functionality, a list of links on a homepage, or add in a list of related links. When additional content is presented on hover or focus, like a tooltip, the user can dismiss it using the escape key, unless the content doesn't obscure any other content. The pointer can hover over the new content without it disappearing, and the content remains visible until the pointer or focus is moved away from the control, or the new content is dismissed or no longer relevant. Unless the user has specifically changed something, navigation links should be in the same order across multiple pages, and elements that do the same thing across multiple pages are labelled the same too. For example, a search bar is labelled as such across multiple pages. Try to give helpful ways for the user to overcome simple problems. For example, if a text field can take in a number of days, months or years, but the user only enters number 6. Instead of just saying that it's invalid, provide a message like, "Did you mean 6 days?" and so on. If you're making a legal commitment or taking payments from a user that modifies or deletes their data, either make sure that it is reversible, or alternatively allow the user to review and check over their information, giving them the opportunity to correct any errors before proceeding. The final point for level AA relates to accessible authentication. We want to avoid forcing the user to log in using a cognitive function test, like remembering a password or solving a captcha puzzle. You can get around this by offering an alternative way to log in, maybe sending a login link to the user's email using Firebase perhaps, or you could assist the user in completing that cognitive function test. However, if the test only involves recognizing objects or identifying non-text content that the user has provided, then that's fine. You should also allow users to use password managers, and they should be able to paste their password into the input field, so please don't disable this by overriding the paste event. If you're using CAPTCHA as a way to prevent bots from abusing your authentication service, you can look at alternatives such as rate limited access. Head over to page 23 of the checklist for some more alternatives. The last level goes even further. It's still worth a watch as it might be something you can easily implement. Let's take a look back at this contrast tracker, because for level AAA, you'll need to ensure that the contrast level is 7:1 for normal text and 4.5:1 for large text. Again, large text is 18 point and above, or if it's bold, then 14 point and above. If you take a look at these examples again, this time only one of them meets the requirement. It's also important to make use of regions and landmarks. Sometimes these can automatically be picked up with semantic elements, like nav or main. But there are other scenarios where you'd want to add in a search region, for example. As we saw previously in the video, we can identify custom controls such as radio buttons using ARIA role attributes. With level AAA, we need to ensure that the purpose of each control can be programmatically determined, and usually that's down to ARIA roles. We saw in level AA that you needed to make sure that the web page was readable if the user were to change the text spacing values. For this level, we need to provide the functionality to do so. Bear in mind that your site doesn't need to meet these spacing values. All you need to do is provide some form of accessibility menu to allow the user to change them. The things you need to include are the ability to change foreground and background colours. Set blocks of text to a width of no more than 80 characters, or 40 if it's Chinese, Japanese or Korean text. We can do that like so. If text is justified, we need to be able to turn that off. We also need to provide the ability to set line spacing to 1.5 times the font size, and paragraph spacing to 1.5 times the line spacing as well. And finally, the ability to increase the font size up to 200% while still remaining readable. If you've got a sequence of pages or a fairly complex structure to your site, you'll need to provide an indication of where the user is in that structure. This could be adding in a breadcrumb tray like this, with ARIA current set for the current page, a step counter such as step 3 of 4 shipping address, a sitemap perhaps, or if the page is in a sequence, you could add in link tags that provide the links to the previous and next pages like so. When implementing focus indicators, we now need to make sure, in addition to what we discussed previously, that the focus ring is 2 pixels thick and has a contrast ratio of 3:1 between the focused and unfocused states. In this example, the contrast between white and dark blue is more than 3:1, and the focus ring is also thick enough to be seen clearly. Make sure the focus ring doesn't get covered in any way, and can be seen at all times when the controller's focus. In level AA, I mentioned that controls should have a target size of 24 by 24 pixels. In this level, we're upping that to 44 by 44 pixels. Unless it's a link in a section of text or is essential to be smaller, controls like buttons should be 44 by 44. If the action this button performs can be achieved by something else with at least a 44 by 44 target size, that would be fine. Any non-essential animation that were to occur if the user clicked on a button, or interacted with the page in any other way, can be disabled by the user. You can achieve this with the Prefers Reduced Motion media query like so. If I go into the Rendering tab in DevTools, I can emulate this media query and turn it on. When I interact with the button, no animation occurs, and when I turn it off again, the animations are back. Next is word usage. For any unusual words or terminology, be sure to describe that word using adjacent text like this first example. using a definition list with a DL element, or by adding in a glossary. Similarly, provide the meaning of any abbreviations. You can do this with the ABBR tag, but if you can, a better way is just to expand it the first time it's used, as that's more visible to the user. You can of course use a glossary as well. With any text, we want to make sure the reading level is suitable for a person with roughly 9 years of primary education. Additionally, if the pronunciation of a word is crucial to understanding that word, this pronunciation is provided either next to the word or in some form of glossary. And some final points to cover for this level. All pre-recorded content should have sign language provided, transcript should be provided for pre-recorded content too, and all live audio content should have a transcript. When providing audio description and there isn't a gap in the video to describe the scene, you should also provide an alternative video where it pauses to describe the scene. Any audio with speech in it should either have no background sounds, the background sounds can be turned off, or the volume of those background sounds is 20 decibels lower than the foreground speech. If you've got occasional sound effects that last for a second or two, then that's fine. We saw some requirements previously that had some exceptions and concessions included. For this level, there's now no exception. This goes for images of text. Text should only be used in an image for decoration or for a logo. All page functionality should be accessible using the keyboard. There are no time limits imposed on the user, unless it relates to a real-time event or video. No content flashes for more than 3 times per second. The purpose of links can be determined from the link text alone, unless the link is meant to be ambiguous, and users are warned of any timeout that could result in data loss, unless the data is preserved for longer than 20 hours of user inactivity. We also covered cognitive function tests as a way to authenticate a user. In this level, either an alternative is available, or the user can get assistance to complete the test. Any interruptions or other distractions to a user's flow can be suppressed or postponed by the user, unless the interruption is related to some sort of emergency. When a user's authenticated session expires, the user should be able to log back in and continue where they left off. Some users might take longer than you'd expect to fill out a form, etc. So it's important to prevent data loss in this way. Content shouldn't require a specific input type. Try not to restrict users to touch-only or keyboard-only input, unless of course this is essential or in place for security reasons. Also, any substantial change to a page or the opening of a pop-up perhaps should be triggered by the user. If a link opens in a new tab, it's useful to mention that in an ARIA label. And finally, when asking the user to submit information, you should make sure the user can review, confirm and correct the information, unless the submission is reversible. Be sure to provide instructions to help with form completion next to the relevant form controls, so the users are clear of the task in hand. Don't forget to download the PDF checklist, which will go into further detail on all points discussed, and of course the WCAG reference documentation contains even more detail. If you're looking for some example apps, I've created a suite of desktop and Android apps that are all open source, and I've also made a language learning site built with Eleventy that's 100% free. Check them both out in the description down below. Be sure to leave a like if you enjoyed this video, and subscribe to keep up to date with the latest from Azul Coding. Thanks for watching this longer than usual video, and I'll see you soon.